When I want to feel nostalgic, I'll hop on YouTube and watch Stephanie Sterling's Squirty Play series. The series initially follows Stephanie as they play games from the prestigious Steam Greenlight program. Remember when that was a thing? But it eventually expands its scope, exploring select titles from Steam Direct and even the PlayStation Store. Stephanie gives commentary as they play, sometimes divulging insights into the game's development team or its dubious arrival to the storefront. And I'll admit, it's a pretty weird series to get nostalgic over, especially because I only discovered their channel a few years ago. It's not like I watched these videos during a formative time in my life or anything. Ditto for the games they cover. I haven't played a single one of them. And why would I? See, the bit of Squirty Play is that every game Stephanie plays has been squirted onto the storefront like pus from a festering sore. In less poetic terms, they're shit games. Dreadful, really, in the worst sense of the word. For starters, they're never much to look at. In fact, the games are usually little more than a few Unity store assets stitched together by shoddy code like some kind of digital Frankenstein's monster. Worse, though, are the whole entire example games lifted from the Unity Asset Store and uploaded to these storefronts behind a paywall. Most circles would call that kind of thing plagiarism or theft. Two very dreadful things, in the worst possible sense of the word. And I've long had this delightful playlist bookmarked so I can watch them whenever I want. This anthology playlist of Squirty Play's worst horror games is the only empirical evidence I need to prove that terrible horror games like these are the cream of the crap crop. Though the fact that these games make me feel nostalgic instead of terrified could also be seen as another piece of evidence, I guess. Anyway, for whatever reason, the Squirty Play horror games consistently look, play, and feel like the worst that Steam has to offer. The asset flipping, bugs, and general scammy feel of Squirty Play titles gets consistently ratcheted up to 11 whenever horror is involved. Perhaps it's because they're horror games. Like, they're supposed to be scary, but when you see the same assets recycled over and over again, when monster AI consistently fails to work, when games are thrown together with zero attention to game design, the game can't build tension, which is the single most important element of any horror experience. When the horror of your horror game can't make it into the spotlight, its flaws get thrown under a microscope that's taped to your eyeballs, and its flaws become all you can see. Which makes Anatomy, the scariest horror game I've ever played, so baffling to me. I mean, come on, it looks like this. Spoilers for Anatomy ahead. It is the scariest game I've ever played, it takes about 40 minutes to complete, and it only costs $3 on itch at the time of writing. You should go buy it, and then you should play it, alone, in the dark. I struggle to succinctly describe Anatomy. It's an experimental horror game from developer Kitty Horror Show, which has the player walk around a darkened suburban home looking for tapes to listen to. But describing the game in that way feels reductive. That description could fit an almost infinite number of asset flips or Slender clones. And again, at a glance, you might not think that an unreasonable comparison. Anatomy's got all the trappings of a horror game. I mean, just look at how dark it is. Excessive darkness is something of a motif among Squirty Play's horror offerings. In an attempt to artificially inflate the tension of a tensionless game, the developers of these horror games will often just turn the brightness to 0. If you're lucky, they'll give you a flashlight, though its beam will only be the size of a pinhead and it'll likely only have about 30 seconds of battery life. If we were to group it up with similar Squirty Play titles, Anatomy would be one of the unlucky games without a flashlight. Here's the magic of Anatomy, though. Its darkness is actually scary. The darkened halls make the house feel genuinely claustrophobic, as though you're physically pushing a cushion of darkness back to get into the next room. At times, it can make rooms like the garage and the basement feel like endless voids, scenes from the abyss. And though the darkness never obscures a monster around the corner, it always feels like it is. The darkness feels like it's solid enough to muffle sounds, leaving the house and any imagined monsters within it cloaked in silence. The darkness of the house in Anatomy is probably the most apparently unwelcoming thing about it. Harkens back to every childhood trip to the basement or down an unlit hall to the bathroom at a sleepover. Back to a time when your brain filled every shadowed corner with ghouls and ghosts. Where in slapdash terrible horror games, this utter darkness would feel like a lazy attempt at tension building, in Anatomy the darkness feels all-consuming, intentional. The same can be said for the architecture and interior design of the house too. Where in lesser horror games, strange architectural decisions might be seen as simply clueless, in Anatomy they feel discomforting and hostile. It seems like a normal enough house at first. Like, you walk in and there's a coat closet in front of you, and the living room is right off to the side, and that's connected to the dining room, which is across from the kitchen. Very common rooms in a house, positioned in sensible ways. But something about the proportions of the rooms feels off. The living room feels just a bit too big, the dining room a bit too small. The strange construction of the house can be felt most upstairs, with its illogically long and angled hallway, which feels like a funnel, sliding you directly into the clutches of some monster waiting just beyond one of those doors. Or, to borrow the game's central metaphor, like an intestine carrying you helplessly into the blackened bowels of the house. The interior design doesn't bring in much comfort either. The furnishing of each room in the house is Spartan, to say the least. Again, reminiscent of some of the terrible video game houses explored in the Squirty Play series. At most, you'll find some chairs, a table, maybe a dresser or an empty shelf. On your first walkthrough, the house looks barely furnished enough to be livable, like it's been hastily abandoned. Or hastily constructed, like a house in a town built to test the impact of atomic bombs. And certainly, walking through the Spartan halls with their strange geometry, the player twists themselves with the thought that the house's former tenants will make their startling return, or that a nuclear bomb could go off any second. Where in a slapdash cash grab, this kind of non-existent interior decoration might be seen as lazy or clueless, in Anatomy it feels purposeful, designed specifically to wind you up as you explore. A fair few of the terrible games covered in Squirty Play don't work properly. Objects get stuck in walls, doors bug out, and Z-fighting textures can be found all over the scene. As a quick aside for the uninformed, Z-fighting is what you see here. Basically, 2 or more polygons are placed right on top of each other in the scene, and the game doesn't know which to render. So it arbitrarily picks out portions of both polygons to render. And in those games, bugs are signs of an inattentive or inexperienced development team. Those are the sorts of issues you never see in solid, well-designed titles, and yet you see them in Anatomy. As you progress through the second cycle, you'll notice Z-fighting on some of the paintings, which are creepy enough already, especially after the switcheroo pulled in the master bedroom at the end of the first cycle. But suddenly seeing them struggle to even exist is downright unsettling. Combined with the broken text pop-ups and increasingly mangled tape quality, the game can start to feel hostile, as though you weren't supposed to boot the game up again, as though you're seeing something you were never meant to see. These feelings only escalate with the third cycle. Chairs clip into walls, plates float in the air, doors open to other doors or become too short to open at all. Black lines run through the walls and floor like necrotic connective tissue. Even the guiding tapes become little more than exploding polygons. The house, or perhaps the game itself, seems to want to annihilate them so that you'll stop listening and leave. And wow, I've talked around it enough. I think it's time to talk about the crashing. The first time you walk through the house and play all the tapes, you hear the rumbling of the tape deck before the game just closes. It happened so abruptly that I thought the game had crashed, as so often happens with terrible horror games. But after launching it again, I was surprised to see that the game had changed. This second playthrough, after the first finished, is what I've been referring to as the second cycle. To fully experience Anatomy, well, you'd need to play through it like a few dozen times to get all 4 of the randomly selected end bits. But to fully experience a single playthrough of Anatomy, you'd need to let the game crash 3 times. Each crash after the first feels not like poor programming, but like an invasion. As though the game's code has hemorrhaged and taken control of your system, even for just a moment, to keep you from playing any further. Anatomy resembles a Squirty Play tier horror game almost whole cloth, and yet, its bugs and crashes are intentional. I mean, even its gameplay resembles a lot of the bargain basement horror games in that it sort of follows the Slender formula. Walk around a spooky place and pick up spooky MacGuffins while the spooky place gets spookier. Slender, influential as it was, wasn't a very good horror game. And I think a large part of that comes down to its repetitive, uninteresting gameplay. Once you've found a few notes, you've found them all. They're just childlike drawings that don't really build up much of a narrative and that are only creepy at all because of how Slenderman's aggression increases with each drawing you gather. The whole time you're collecting these, you're dreading the moment he finds you, and sure enough, it's pretty much mathematically guaranteed that he will. He'll come into your line of sight and turn your computer monitor into noisy TV static for a few seconds before he boots you back to the main menu. And Anatomy players will likely bring knowledge of Slender and its less than stellar progeny to the game. That knowledge will, to some extent, color the player's experience as they wander through the darkened halls of the house searching for tapes. The whole time they'll dread the monstrous jump scare at the end of the final tape. What's more, the message from the tapes is frightening on its own.
The basement is dark. It is buried. It is a place full of cobwebs where memories are stored. A poignant comparison, truly. Often the unnerving uncertainty that comes with considering the deeper aspects of the human psyche is not unlike gazing down at the swimming blackness pooled at the bottom of a basement stairwell. It is a place we spend our childhoods filling with monsters that will lay for years in patient silence.
Or at least it's more frightening than contextless drawings or keys. Dissecting a house as you would a human cadaver is weird and interesting, and the lecturely tone of the narrator makes it feel important. With those tapes being just about the only audio in the game, they really affect your perception of the house. Remember earlier when I compared the upstairs hallway to an intestine or a funnel leading into a gaping maw? Despite their anatomical underpinnings, the tapes never drew those comparisons. That's just what I was thinking as I walked up there for the first time. But the increasingly gory and specific metaphor of the tapes is what really makes it all click. It feels like it's building up to something, to some grand and horrifying reveal where the tapes confront you directly and a meat monster pops up to make you scream, but that never happens. You follow the tapes both for curiosity's sake, where is this going, and for the sake of release. Please let Slenderman pop out and screech at me so I can scream and release all this tension. Maybe what separates Anatomy's gameplay and narrative from lesser horror games is that while those games use similar elements as a way to prime the player for a jump scare or a spooky monster, Anatomy primes you to freak yourself out. The game never lets you scream. It makes you want to scream, beg to even, but masterfully, it never gives you the satisfaction of relief. The thread of tension that other horror experiences tangle up in you are untangled momentarily by a scream, before that horror experience starts tangling it up all over again. Eventually, you'll get inured to it. It stops becoming scary. Anatomy, though, leaves that tension tangled up inside of you, churning for minutes or hours or days afterwards. Boiling down what separates Anatomy from similar looking but messier horror experiences to one distinct element is absurd. But in the interest of keeping this conclusion short, I will. It's craft. I think Stephanie explains it best in these two clips.
Look, you see that? The doors look a bit fleshy. If any of this had been done on purpose, this would be quite Silent Hillish. But the fact that it's all mistakes renders it quite amusing. The anatomy of this fucking house, and I'll use the word anatomy because I don't think architects made this fucking place.
The bug texture of the door in The Last Patient and the bizarre layout of the house in Evil, when placed in a vacuum, are legitimately creepy. The fleshy contraction of the doors feels utterly uncanny, and even borders on body horror. The alien architecture and interior design of the house make it feel like a liminal space. And of course, there's the fact that games aren't supposed to look like that, which can make visual bugs and quirks like these jarring. Of course, we're still talking about the door in the house as though they're in a vacuum, where they would be creepy. But they're not in a vacuum. They're constituent parts of complete games, and in their native, bumbling contexts, they're not creepy. They're funny at best and insulting at worst, emblematic of the ineptitude and arbitrariety of the games they're found in. Absolutely no element of anatomy, from its obtrusive darkness to its visual glitches to the placement of the chairs in the living room, is arbitrary. Nothing can be chalked up to inexperience or inattentiveness. Every single decision in the process of this game's development was intentional, likely thought out well in advance of its implementation. The game and all of its assets were purpose-built to invoke dread in its players, to make them question the safety of their own homes, not from intruders like monsters or murderers, but from the home itself. Anatomy's singular, absolute clarity of vision is what makes it stand so far above so many of its peers, and even some of its betters. Where the cumbersome gameplay and glitches of its peers come from trend hopping and inexperience, Anatomy's comes from a deep understanding. Not only an understanding of how to craft good horror, but how to break the medium of video games to elevate that horror further. Where lesser titles like the chaos of bugs and poor design run rampant through their games, Anatomy takes that chaos by the balls and shapes it into something more. Something dreadful, really. In the best possible sense of the word.